So welcome to CPA's 10 Steps to Offering a Complete App Advisory Service. I'd now like to introduce you to Gavin Ord from CPA Australia, who's the Manager of Business Investment Policy. Going ahead and unmuting you. Good day to you, Gavin. Over to you.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining for today's webinar, which has been sponsored by Intuit QuickBooks. So today's webinar, as you can see, the title is 10 Steps to Offering a Complete App Advisory Service. And the presenter is Grant Quick. Grant is the Senior Solutions Engineer at Intuit, and he specialises in working with larger accounting firms in the Australian market. Grant is passionate about emerging technologies and how they can be used to drive meaningful business change. Grant previously worked in enterprise architecture, where he helped some of the world's largest organisations make sense of their IT landscapes and align their technology roadmaps with their business strategies. And yes, we all hope that we can get our technology roadmaps to align with our business strategies. So I'll now pass over to Grant to deliver today's webinar. Thank you, Grant.
Michelle, it's a pleasure being here today, and thanks everyone for joining us. As Gavin mentioned, we're going to be talking about app advisory. And in my role at Intuit, I have been meeting with a lot of firms, especially on the larger side, over the last 12 months. And one thing that's really been coming up a lot has been questions around apps and app advisory. And I think it's because it is such a new area. It's an area where a lot of firms know that there's a potential service offering that they can put there, but they're not quite sure how to make that happen, what the first steps will be, and how ultimately they're going to build a business model around that. So those are the kinds of things we're going to look at today. What is surprising, though, to me is that it's not a problem that's only one kind of firm. Oftentimes, a lot of smaller firms will think, well, I'm a little bit behind the 8 ball here. But honestly, this is something that I hear from all sizes of companies, right up to the very top. There's very few that have app advisory services that go beyond one single office. Even the really largest guys don't have a real consolidated approach. So it's something that really I think any business in accounting or in bookkeeping can really start to get their head into and find a way that they can provide value for their customers. Now, system integrations have been around for a long time. But cloud integrations are something that are quite new, obviously, because cloud technologies are something that is relatively new in the market. As an engineer, I've been involved in a lot of large system integration projects in the past, but they look quite different to how cloud integration projects look. And that's because in the past, the real focus was on the actual programming of building a connection between two applications that didn't talk to each other. Nowadays, there's a lot of middleware technologies as well as pre-built integrations that you have between applications. And so it's really a different space where you're looking at off-the-shelf kinds of solutions that are cloud-based that can talk to each other, and it's more of a question of how you configure them to work optimally together. So we'll dig in. There's about, as I mentioned, there's 10 steps that we'll go through today. In looking at how you can start to do this. We're going to start by looking at the kinds of problems that your clients might have, look at the value that you can provide, look at who you can team with to fill any gaps that you might have in your service offering, identify the constraints that your clients might have that you need to work within, summarize the options that they have, and then we'll really get into the implementation side before you go live and how you can really start to get into this today. So starting with the first step, we're looking at the problem. And it sounds kind of obvious. If you're looking to build a solution, you want to make sure you have a problem to that. But actually, you'd be surprised the number of advisors that I talk to that are looking at, we want to get into app advisory. How can we understand all the apps that are out there? There's so many, but we need to become experts on all of them. And by taking that approach, they really are just solution focused. They're not taking a step back and looking at what are the problems that we're going to solve. Ultimately, there's many thousands of applications that are out there in the cloud ecosystem. With QuickBooks, we have about 6,000 different applications that integrate with us. We don't publicise all of them because the ones that we do publicise basically have to go through a very strict security assessment. But even so, there's many, many hundreds of applications out there for any particular region that might be able to offer solutions. So being able to deal with that just simply isn't practical. You can't know everything, and so you really need to start with what is the customer's needs. And so if you're looking at getting into this space, the first place I would say to look is what kind of customers do you have? Is there a particular vertical that tends to gravitate towards your firm? For example, if 80% of your clients are lawyers, then it probably doesn't make sense to be looking at inventory solutions and things of that nature. So make sure you're focusing on those areas and then really get deep into the problem. So over time, you'll learn how to ask the right questions, but really being able to elicit what some of those constraints are that the business works with and what the core of their problem is that they're trying to solve is key to really getting things off on the right foot. And ultimately, when you're looking at this, also remember that it's all well and good to look at lots of problems, but you've really got to focus on the ones that you can solve. So if you're going to get into this space, make sure you know what that is. And if someone comes to you with a problem that you just aren't really qualified to help with, that's the time to then think about how we can potentially advise that client to get help somewhere else. So once you're looking at the problems that surround your clients, that's really where you can start to identify the value that you can provide. So we're looking at the value proposition that we have. As an advisor, sometimes it's easy to take for granted just how advanced your financial analysis skills are. So that's the first area to really look is what do we know really well? And it might not just be that, there might be other areas that you've dealt with a lot. If you've got a lot of clients in a particular vertical, you might now know quite a lot about that area and already be somewhat of a subject matter expert there. So it might make sense for you to go a bit beyond in that particular space. But ultimately, if you are getting into this area, there probably is going to be quite a bit of learning that's required. And so it comes back to how many clients do you have that will benefit from that? Can you justify the amount of time and cost that you put into training up yourself and your team, or even acquiring new resources to be able to build that advisory practice? Because ultimately, if you're not going to have the number of clients, there's really not a cost justification for doing that. So focus on areas where you don't have to put as much effort in and really are attainable to provide that kind of value. Now, one thing to really point out is if you are going to recommend applications, you need to know more than one application. Like I said, a lot of advisors, when they come in, they're looking very broad, and so they ultimately want to just settle on one application per space. But that's not going to really provide much value to your clients. Ultimately, they can do a Google search and figure out, well, here's one application that solves my problem. It's really about knowing the nuance of those solutions and what some of the trade-offs might be, where the real value is. So you can certainly get started with that. You can start to look in and identify certain applications that are very commonly used in a particular vertical. But ultimately, you want to be careful about getting into making recommendations before you really know that particular area quite well. And you can certainly still provide value, just be very careful with the way that you start to position what it is that you're offering to clients, and be very clear about the limits of your expertise.
Grant, it's Gavin. Can I just ask a question? So where could people learn more about some of those applications so they get a broader in-depth and nuanced understanding of what's out there?
Yeah, great question, Gavin. So first thing I'd actually recommend is Intuit has a website, www.apps.com. So if you have a look there, you can actually search through applications that we have done security assessments for. As I mentioned, we don't publicize on our App Store any applications that haven't been through that due diligence. So that's a great place to kind of know broadly what applications you might find in particular spaces. Somewhere else to start looking broadly is just at trade shows. So there's a number of trade shows coming up quite soon actually, and there'll be a lot of app vendors as well as cloud integrators there. So go and introduce yourself, find out what it is that they're about, and see what it is that they offer, and you might find that there's some value there. Also talk to your clients that already have integrations with different products and find out how they work for them, what are some of the pros, why are they a good fit or why are they not a good fit for that particular client. So then once you've kind of looked at that space of applications that are out there, that's really when you can start to identify the partners that can help you with your offering. Now, if you've identified those apps, what you can often do is talk to them and find out who are the cloud integrators that they work with. Cloud integrators is really a new thing. They've only been around for about the last 5 to 10 years because cloud is so new. And their skill set really is on that configuration piece that I mentioned earlier. So they work in one very specific area, they know the apps in that area very well, and they know how to configure the systems. Because they are working with those apps all the time, they are very up to date on all the changes that are in those applications just from being in there and using them themselves. So that's obviously a depth of knowledge that you often won't have time to get to yourself. So this is where those cloud integrators become really, really critical to partner with. And certainly I think the best way to do that is to talk to the application vendors themselves and find out who do they recommend as a good cloud integrator when someone needs that kind of a service. And you'll start to find ones that really work with the way that you see the world, and you'll be able to team with them really well. Most of them are actually really happy to talk to advisors. Many of them will actually help you if you're working with a client to kind of rule out what are some of the bad solutions they want to avoid and what might be a good fit, just at a very high level. They'll be happy to have those kind of conversations with you at no cost. And then when you do want to get to that deeper level of engagement, that's where they can start to work in with you and help build a project plan that's going to deliver the customer what they really need. Now, if we look at step 4, that's where we start to get into constraints. I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail with these ones because they are really important. Ultimately, when you're working with a lot of small businesses or even medium-sized businesses, they don't have endless resources at their disposal. If they did, they might hire a big software team to go and implement a bespoke system that solves their problem perfectly. But ultimately, they don't have that luxury, and that's why they're looking at pre-built cloud systems to help give them a solution to what they need. And so when we start to look at some of these constraints, one that's really important is the usability of the system. Now, if you go and you talk to the app vendors, chances are they're probably going to all tell you that it's a really usable system, it's really easy to use. What some of them don't qualify is that it's really easy to use if you've got a PhD in their software. That's not the case for all of them, but certainly getting those kind of recommendations from the app vendors themselves can be not necessarily the most unbiased source of information, but it's really key that you understand that. And it comes back to not just the usability of the system itself, but how it works with the processes that the business is working with today. So if you have a progressive company that has been through a lot of change already, the workforce has benefited from that change, chances are they'll want to get in with the best of breed solution that they can. And so you can work with them from that lens. Whereas on the other hand, you might have a company that's been doing the same thing for 20 years, got all the same employees from that time. They might be less hesitant to, or more hesitant, I should say, to change. And if that's the case, then maybe you need to think about the solution that works well with the way that they do things today. So you're minimizing the disruption to them, and they're able to succeed with what they do, enjoy some streamlining, but it may not be the ultimate end state that might work for another company. Legal issues also become really a big issue, especially when you start to look at very niche industries. A lot of the app offerings will be coming from overseas vendors. And in those cases, you need to be really careful because if your client operates in Australia, you need to make sure that the product is compliant with Australian codes and regulations. or if the business might have operations in another region. They might have operations in, say, Singapore, the UK, or somewhere like that, and you need to make sure that the solution is also compliant in those regions. Sometimes you might find that there just simply isn't a solution, but maybe it's okay to go with one that's not compliant and implement some workarounds. So it might be less than ideal, but it might be the best that you can do with the situation at hand. So do keep those in mind, because legal requirements can really derail a project very quickly if you don't make sure that the solutions you're dealing with are going to satisfy those. Security is another big one that really doesn't get looked at commonly enough. A lot of advisors are very conscious of security when it comes to their accounting software. And for that reason, a lot of people were very slow to move to cloud with their accounting solutions. But over time, a lot of people have come to realize, well, actually, having our data in the cloud is more secure with certain providers than it is to have a server in our office that could, die or be stolen or who knows what. So a lot of that now is in the backs of the minds of advisors who've been through that journey and know how important security is. But having said that, a lot of advisors will not necessarily look at the security of the third-party apps. And if there's a lot of data being passed from the accounting solution to those third-party apps, suddenly you're essentially creating a back door for nefarious parties to come in and access that data in ways that the client had not authorized or desired. So it's really important to understand, how does that third-party app deal with security? Do they host their services with a cloud provider like AWS or Azure? If so, that's not the end of the world. There's a lot of other things they still have to do. So find out what they put in place to make sure that they're protecting their clients' data. Now, that can be hard to ascertain. Some people do put it on their websites, but a lot of the smaller players in particularly won't. So you will have to basically call them up and ask them about that. To find out what kinds of things you should ask about, it's worth having a look at security.intuit.com. We do put in all of the security kinds of things that we put in place to ensure that we're protecting our clients' data. So you'll get a lot of ideas there about what you can look for in third-party apps. And ultimately, if they're not willing to share that kind of data with you, it might be an indication that their security is not up to scratch. As I mentioned before, apps.com, another way you can find out about vendors that have been through security screening, so you know that there is some level of security there. Now, reliability is another area where it can really derail a business, especially if they're looking at using this particular system with their business critical processes. If the system doesn't work for 2 weeks, that could be enough to put some businesses out of business entirely. So you've got to be really careful with that. Some vendors will give you information about things like their mean time to repairs and how often failures occur. Oftentimes they won't. So the best thing to do in those cases is to really talk to people who've been using the system. So you might know cloud integrators, or it might be other advisors who have clients using it, or it might be your clients yourself. So find out what it's like and how much tolerance there is for the client that you're working with to make sure that there's not a disconnect there. If you look at scalability too, one system that works well for one client with, say, 100 transactions a month may not work so well for a client who has 1,000 transactions a month. So knowing how much data needs to be processed is really critical for making sure you make the right kinds of recommendations. I know just from the cloud accounting space, a lot of systems do tend to fall over at that 1,000 transaction a month limit. So it's really important to make sure if it's a business that has more than that, they've got a solution in place that will scale with them. Vendor stability is something else that you may not consider. Obviously, the solution itself is one thing, but also the vendor that backs it is another. A lot of small players do have very few sources of funds. They might have 1 or 2 venture capitalists behind them, for example, as their main source of funding. And if one of those venture capitalists gets cold feet and decides they're not going to fund the company anymore, it can basically roll up their operations overnight. And so suddenly you don't have any support from the vendor, you don't know what's happening in the future, and so forth. They may just turn off their cloud application entirely overnight. So it's really important to understand how strong the vendor is, how long have they been around, and what does their roadmap look like for the future that will ensure that they remain successful and viable and able to remain viable as a business. Backup is something else. Some cloud apps will allow you to do your own backups and store them where you like. Others will do those backups themselves, and that's probably more typical. If they are doing that, find out where do they store their backups. Is it in the same data center? Because if there's a natural disaster, maybe that's not going to protect you. And if they are doing backups, how often are they performed, and how long does it take to get the data back up? Coming back to the reliability piece, if it takes them 2 weeks to get the data back up, that might kill some businesses. It might also be enough to kill businesses if they just lose a certain amount of data if things haven't been backed up in the last 2 weeks. So definitely an area that needs to be considered. And last but not least is certainly cost. I put it last because I don't like to emphasize cost. The thing that's really important about cost is the return on investment. Ultimately, the cloud subscription price of some of these solutions really can be quite trivial compared to the value that they can provide. So you do need to do a more detailed analysis of what the cost is going to look like in terms of how much money is the business going to save, in terms of reduced labor costs, reduced efficiencies and so forth, and then compare that back to what are the costs going to be, not only from the cloud subscription, but anything else that might be involved in terms of support level agreements and things like that. So think about that from that particular lens, and don't just go for solutions that are cheap with their price tag. There's lots of other things you can look at. I've listed a few there. Things like the ethics of the company that you're dealing with, the performance of their application, things of that nature. So different things will be important for different clients. So make sure you focus on the ones that are going to matter to them.
Grant, that's really interesting, that page. One thing I took from that was around doing your due diligence. So that's sort of something I definitely got from that. We do have a question from Suk Ling. It's more of a general question around there's I don't know if you can see that, Grant. How do you get yourselves well equipped for all the apps? Some of them may require certification or learning before you can familiarise yourself with it. So it can be a bit overwhelming, as you can imagine. How do you handle this potentially overwhelming nature of all the apps that are available?
Yeah, great question. It comes back to what I said before with finding partners. A lot of this stuff is going to take a lot of time if you want to be the experts on it. It doesn't mean you shouldn't get into app advisory yet. It just might mean you're not ready to get into that space yet. So a lot of advisors will provide a lot of value with the relationship that they have with the clients. They've been working with them for a long time. They have that trust. And that's something that a cloud integrator, for example, is not going to have because they're going to be coming to this business very fresh without that established relationship. So you can leave it to the cloud provider, or the cloud integrator, I should say, to really make those recommendations and analyze those constraints around the due diligence that they've previously done with these applications, and you can still bring value to the table. Now, as time goes on, there might be more and more of that you can do, but it's really key, I think, just to make sure that you don't bite off more than you can chew, keep it manageable, and see this as a journey where you're going to improve over time. It's not something where you're going to start offering this service and do it completely and perfectly on day one. So if we look now at summarizing the options, we've done our due diligence, we can start to look at what are the viable options. So it's really about eliminating solutions that are not a good fit, as opposed to coming with one strong recommendation for the client. Once again, it comes down to the role that you're playing. If you're doing a lot of this analysis before passing over to a cloud integrator, it's really important that you're not in any way making a recommendation, because ultimately the cloud integrator will be going deeper with them. And if you're setting expectations that one particular solution is a great fit and it turns out that maybe it's not for reasons you weren't aware of, it can create a lot of work for the cloud integrator to try and backpedal and get away from that. So only go as far as your expertise takes you, and summarize what you can. This is really an area where even if you are just providing the very basics, you can start to educate your client on what it is that they should be looking for, and the fact that there probably is not going to be a perfect solution for them. There's going to be trade-offs that they're going to have to make, and you can start to get them educated on what those trade-offs will be and how they can start to prioritize those. One thing you can do based on the relationship you have with your client, that say a cloud integrator cannot do, is get more in depth with tailoring your recommendations and your suggestions around their learning style. You might know that certain clients are more visual or more verbal. Some will benefit from having a demo and others might find that overwhelming. So it's really a case of figuring out how to best communicate to that particular client and work with whoever you're teaming with here to make sure that the message comes across clearly about how that can be done. And so to show you a few examples of what that might look like, here's a matrix example. We're showing just 3 solutions here. There might be a lot more that are being considered, and we're only looking at 3 aspects here. So there's typically going to be a lot more than that. But just for the example here, you can see that in each of the cells, we're looking at the intersection of that particular feature or constraint and how the solution compares to the competition in that area. So we look down at legal at the bottom. That one's quite interesting because you'll see that it really depends on the client as to how these scores are going to be calculated. So this particular client might have operations in Australia and America, and this solution needs to support both. So the solution that gets the highest score is number 1 because it's an American product and it's been fully customized for the Australian market as well. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got solution 3, only 1 star because it works great for the Australian market, but it's not compliant in any way, shape or form for the US. So for a completely different client, they might have very similar needs, but just that one aspect might be enough to tell them, hang on, this solution, while it might have been a great fit for company XYZ, we're not that company. We have our own requirements, and being able to work in both of those markets is key to our success, so we can't go for the same solution that worked for them. Another way you might do things is start to really analyze the processes that the business has, especially if you're looking at a complicated workflow that's going to be simplified by this solution. This is a great way to do things. So the most common notation, if you're looking for one in this area, is called BPMN, Business Process Modeling Notation. What I'm showing here is actually a simplified version of BPMN. There's a few things missing from the standard, but you'll get the idea of what it shows. We're looking at swim lane diagrams. Each of these swim lanes is showing a particular actor or stakeholder that's involved in the process. And you can see the tasks that they have to carry out to make it move from the start to the finish. Now, as you can see in this particular example, we're looking at the process for when goods are received at the dock. It's going from something that's very manual to something that gets very streamlined by the solution. So what we see on the right-hand side is very, very simplified compared to the current state. So that's something that can really illustrate the value that certain solutions are going to provide. And in some cases, the way that the solution will look from a process perspective will be very different from one solution to another. So it's really key to make sure that the customer understands not just the software, but also the impact it's going to have on their operations. Now we start to move more towards the implementation side of things. And usually that's going to start by scoping. So before you actually start really rolling up your sleeves and getting something implemented, it's really key that expectations are set on both sides. If you aren't clear together on what it is that you're solving and how you're going to solve that, you're going to get what's called scope creep very quickly. And the customer's expectations are going to change, your expectations are going to change. You're setting yourselves up for either a very expensive project that doesn't make any money, or you're setting yourselves up for failure. So either way, make sure that you have these sessions and set those expectations. And regardless of whether you're the person that's going to be doing the implementation, your role as an advisor is key. For one, you've got that ability to really have those frank conversations with your customer, given the background that you've got with them. You can make sure that they're understanding things the way that they need to be understood. And also, because you understand their business in ways that they may not, you can bring that to the table and make sure that the cloud integrators are aware of those things. If you're working with simpler solutions, things like receipt bank, fathoms, reporting applications that accounting companies will deal with in their own practices, those are areas where you may not need a cloud integrator. So you might be doing this yourself, but once again, make sure you're setting those clear expectations so that the project is starting off on the right foot and is really able to go down a path towards success. One thing to keep in mind is how the solution gets rolled out. It might be iterative or it might be big bang. Anyone who's been involved in implementations will usually shudder at the term big bang, but the reality is that sometimes it has to be. If a particular customer has something that's really core to them that they're replacing, sometimes they can't go offline with the previous solution until the new solution is ready. And so there really does have to be a big bang moment. But do think about how you can try and simplify and stage the rollout as much as possible, because that is going to de-risk the project and simplify things a lot. The other thing to start thinking about in scoping sessions are the kinds of skills that will be needed. So educate early and get started in the training process very early to make sure that you've got key stakeholders that are on the journey with you, understand the project early and can identify areas where things might be going off rails very quickly.
Grant, that's really interesting. Sorry, Grant, that's really interesting. So, and I think we've all worked on IT projects which have been haven't been great. So, in terms of what are some of the common errors you see in scoping out a session? You said there's scope creep. Is it not just on the customer side, but also on the provider side? Sometimes do they sometimes overpromise or do not understand their clients? So my question probably is, what do you see as the common errors and how do you mitigate those risks?
Yeah, and this is somewhere where things have changed quite a bit with the direction towards cloud. Because in the past, scope creep was really more about customers not communicating what their requirements were and having expectations that the implementers weren't aware of. But now what you're doing is really bringing in a pre-built solution that already has its feature set. And so you're basically configuring that to solve a problem. Now why that's different is because these solutions will often have lots of different features that aren't really necessary for solving the problem. And so it's important to be really clear about what it is you are solving and what it is that the solution offers. It's really common for people to get caught up in the bells and whistles and start thinking about, well, this solution has all these great features that would be really handy for us to have, and you can certainly go down that track later. But for the initial implementation, make sure everyone's really clear on what parts of the system are going to be used, how they're going to be integrated with the accounting solution or any other solutions that are part of the equation, and get it written down, make it really clear, so as time progresses, people's memories don't change and you get caught out. So now if we start to get into the implementation itself, once we've got that scoping out of the way, one of the best things to consider is whether you should do a proof of concept or a pilot project. And the short answer is nearly always yes. There will be exceptions, but where possible, it's really key to try and make sure you learn early. If you can start to put a proof of concept into place that really educates the client on exactly what the solution is going to look like and whether it's a fit for them, you can really start to nip any problems in the bud early that might have cropped up later in the project. Now what that involves with a proof of concept, usually with cloud solutions, is that you put the cloud solution in place side by side with the existing solution and you let people work with it. Try and do some of the basic integrations with either of the accounting solution they're using or one that's similar, but focus more on just doing what's easy. So don't focus on all the deep configuration that can happen and will happen over the course of the implementation. Instead, just focus on what comes out of the box, so to speak, with that solution. And you can then see, is this overall a good fit with the configurations? Will this really check the boxes that need to be checked? Or are we going in the wrong direction? Do we need to have a rethink about the solution that we had in mind and think about maybe going back and selecting something else? Once again, think about how this can be staged. It comes down to which users might you be able to get in first, which workflows might you be able to get in first. You don't have to solve the whole solution at once. If there's going to be multiple workflows, try and do one at a time and roll it out as you can. Obviously, that's not always possible, but where it is, try and do that.
Grant, there's just going back to scoping, there's another question from Sukling. I don't know if you can see it in the chat box there, but it says, the question is, do you do top-down approach for scoping or the other way around? For example, what is the desired result you want to achieve, then do the scoping? Which way do you think should be done?
That's a really good question. Now, the textbook answer would be always go top-down. The reality is you're probably going to do a mixture of these things. So I would say try and do as much top-down as possible. You know, it comes back to really starting at the problem with this process and working down that way in terms of scoping down what it is that we can solve from that problem. Are we solving the entire problem? If we are, how does the solution solve it? And what areas are we going to focus on to make that happen? But sometimes you will have clients that just don't have a clear understanding of what it is they're solving. And sometimes you can actually bring the proof of concept forward before you even get into implementation. Think about it during that elicitation of requirements phase when you're trying to understand the problem. Try and get them to use some solutions to draw out some insights about what it is that they really want and what it is they're looking for. So ideal world, top down, but reality, sometimes you've got to mix it up. Now, if we get into testing, testing is really a key piece of the implementation itself. A lot of people think of testing as something that comes at the end. And once again, that's a mistake that you really need to try and avoid. Because the sooner you identify a problem, the quicker and cheaper it will be to be able to solve that problem. If you're starting to implement things and you go down a big rabbit hole that just simply was avoidable at the start, that's obviously something that you don't want to do. So think about how you can start testing right at the beginning. That will come into the proof of concepts, for example, if you're doing those. Or otherwise, just get some of the core stakeholders that you identified during the scoping and before then, and so get them trained up so they can be helping you with the testing and they can give you those insights that they need. Coming back to usability, that's an area where you really can't test that yourself. You might have an inkling for one solution being more usable than another, but it really comes down to how usable is this for the end users that are going to be day in, day out using this system. And it comes down to their expertise. Maybe one solution you don't find intuitive, but it's because that's not the area that you spend day in and day out. Maybe the terminology is confusing, whereas people that do have their nose to the coalface every day, that is the terminology they use, and so maybe it's not the issue that you thought it was. So ultimately, having those people involved very early is key to making sure that you test successfully and avoid pitfalls that might have come up otherwise. The other thing with testing is really to use as much real data as possible. So the migration of data between cloud systems is actually something that typically is one of the easier things to do. And so it's usually pretty easy to get at least some of the data across for testing purposes. Just make sure that you've got some plan in process so that if you are using that particular instance for the go live production offering, you can clean out that test data and do a final migration, or if you're using a separate system that you can turn that off and then bring the real data in after it's been updated just before go live. And that's really important, is that there always does need to be, or nearly always needs to be, a migration right at the end Some systems, the data might be so bad you're actually not even going to migrate it. You'll just start from scratch. But typically, if you are doing migrations, you need to make sure that happens at the end, because while you're undertaking this implementation, life goes on for the business. They're not going to stop using their old systems while you're doing this. You need to make sure that that data gets captured when you do the switch over.
Just so, Grant, there's a further question on, but going back to implementation, if you see that in the chat box. It's just a sort of a general question. Do you get the client involved in the implementation stage, or do you use your own resources and then only get the client involved towards the end?
Yep, good question. So the client should definitely be involved in the implementation phase 99.9% of the time. What's key though is that you may not involve all of the users. Initially it might just be a few key stakeholders, but you really need to get their inputs during the implementation to make sure that you're not missing obvious things, make sure they're happy with how things are going. If you just cordon yourself off in a room for a few weeks, if it's a longer implementation, and you don't communicate back to the client, they're probably not going to be happy unless you deliver them a 110% perfect solution. So it's really important that you take the client on that journey, not just for the learnings that you'll get, but also for managing their expectations. Now, probably the most important thing, I think, for advisors that are getting into this space is really understanding what your role is going to be after go live. Because this is really the area where I think a lot of advisors that are new to using apps can still provide a lot of benefit. And so it's really about understanding how that looks. When a cloud integration project gets wrapped up, if you're using a cloud integrator, they're typically going to be working quite closely with that client straight after the go live to make sure things are working as expected. They might still be making little tweaks here and there, but as time goes on, they're going to remove themselves quite quickly from working with that client. So it might be over a period of 3 to 6 months, say. And then after that, the relationship is primarily going to be back between the advisor and the client. And so that's something where you can make sure that any of the new data that this system is capturing can be part of your analysis. If you think about the kinds of insights you can give your client, really the sky's the limit. And it comes down to basic business advisory. If you are starting to get into that space with your cloud accounting solutions, you might be looking at KPIs and analysis of things that are going through the cloud solution. And now suddenly you've got a whole another data set of this business that could really benefit their decision making. And so that's really, I think, where a lot of the value is that advisors can come in even if they don't feel comfortable being heavily involved in the implementation and so forth. And to be honest, this is often the most lucrative part of their advisory, and it's the least risky as well. So if there's only one area that you want to be involved in application advisory, I would say make this your starting area and think about how you can drive this with your clients. Now, a key part of it is how are you going to get the data out of the system if you are going to provide advisory around that. Obviously, you may be able to log directly into the system and get it yourself. That's usually not ideal, and oftentimes the client won't give you access to that system because either it's restricted to just on-site or there's other implications around user numbers and things like that. So look at how you might be able to draw that out into, say, a dashboard view. There's other tools that you can use for that. There's very basic business intelligence tools that will draw out the data for you in a pre-canned format. And then there's others at the other end of the spectrum that allow you to build your own customized dashboards from the ground up. And so what the best solution is going to depend on what it is that you're analyzing and whether there's a pre-built solution that can give you those insights. Now, this is an area where you might actually start to build up your own expertise. If you're building your own dashboards, there's certain tools you might become expert in. It might be things like Fathom, or it might be things right at the other spectrum like Power BI or Tableau. where you can start to have complete flexibility over how you build these dashboards. And so once you do that, you can start to have those come in very easily, so you can digest them and then convert them into some format, whether it's a meeting that you have with the client on a regular basis, a report that you give them, or maybe it's direct access to a dashboard, so that they can understand what are those metrics that can help us to make better business decisions. Now, a lot of cloud integrators will provide expertise around things like Power BI, so you might continue to work with them on that. One key call out is actually that you want to make sure the system is pretty settled down before you start building those kind of dashboards, because ultimately if there's going to be further system configuration, you want to make sure that you're not having to go back and redesign your dashboards every time.
Grant, there's a question from Sarah, and it's very much on your comments around building your own expertise. And the question is, what is the value in bringing a developer or data scientist in-house to your firm to roll out this service offering? Do you see that as being something you could do or shouldn't do?
Yeah, now I would strongly recommend looking at that area, and there's a lot of firms that are getting there now. They're not necessarily looking at this from an app advisory point of view at the moment, but a lot of firms are starting to hire data scientists because they see business advisory as the area that they really need to get deeper and more expert in, and being able to work with and manipulate data is something that's just, they haven't got the skill set to do it at the level that they need. So looking at people like data scientists, if you are going to focus on that business advisory piece that comes after app implementation, that's somewhere where a data scientist can provide a lot of value. As for developers and that side of things, there's probably less value unless you're really getting into really bespoke integrations, because most of what you're going to do is going to be configuration of cloud systems that can talk to each other already. If they don't talk directly, there might be something like a Zapier or another product out there that can connect them. There's going to be less actual coding to build those kind of integrations, and there's less and less reliance on development skills to really get a lot of those data insights out because of the data science tools and platforms that are available today. So I would say, yes, definitely consider other roles, and I would have data scientists right at the top of that list. Now, the final step is really to walk away today and think about how you can get started. So we've talked about a lot of the different areas that are involved, where the gotchas are, and so forth. But today you can start looking at your client portfolio, talk to the other advisors in your firm and figure out, are there certain problems that our client base are asking about that they need help with? And what are the areas that are really things that we're well suited to? So I come back to inventory. Inventory is a really difficult one that very few advisors, I think, are going to go down that route and provide complete advisory. There might be a few depending on their backgrounds, but more likely advisors are going to get involved in things like point of sale systems that aren't a big stretch from their existing skill set. So if you're looking at those areas, that might be somewhere where you can start. Learn about the apps in those spaces. So as I mentioned, go to apps.com and look from there. Start talking to other advisors that you know, and then talk to the apps themselves, find out who the cloud integrators are, and they might shed light on other apps that are out there that you weren't aware of as well. So it's really about, I think, building a network is really key to making this a success. Even if you're not going to leverage that network much in the offering that you provide, just knowing those people and having a sounding board can be a huge benefit when you're getting into this space. Identify those potential partners, as I mentioned. It might not just be cloud integrators, it might be other advisors that might have particular skill sets, especially if you are talking about things like data science. Maybe before you get into that space, you'd like to just have another advisor that you can partner with to provide that expertise. And then, of course, think about the business model, how you might commercialize this. But whatever you do, make sure you always keep the client success first. The biggest path to having an application advisory service that doesn't stick is really having something that provides no value to your clients. Not only are you going to have no clients that want to do application advisory in the future, you're going to ruin the relationship that you have with your clients just for the compliance work that you do with them today. So make sure that you're not in this just for the extra revenue. Make sure you've always got their needs at heart, and don't hesitate to involve other professionals that can really enhance that engagement with bringing those apps to life. So just in summary, we'll go to questions after I get through this, you know, analyze the problem before jumping to the solution is really one of the keys. Don't start by looking at lots of apps and saturating yourself with all the different apps that are out there. Figure out where your focus areas will be first, relating back to the problems, and then you can start to look at solutions that can potentially solve those problems. You can't do everything, so figure out what your strengths are, stick to them, and find partners who can cover those things that you don't have any expertise in. And there's no shame in that. That's ultimately, if you look at your clients, you'll probably find the ones that are most successful are the ones that really know their weaknesses and know how to find other people that can help them with that. That's ultimately why a lot of them came to you for their advisory in the first place. They weren't tax experts. They weren't necessarily experts with understanding financial figures. So they're able to leverage their partnership with you to do that. So think about how you can find partners to do the same thing to make your own success. Involve the right stakeholders. Make sure you've got senior enough people, but also make sure that you've got people that know the processes very well. So people from top to bottom, find those key people that are really needed to make sure that you have a successful outcome. Scope carefully for your own protection as well as for your own client success to make sure you can keep the project on time and deliver to expectations. Test early, test often. Rarely do I hear people say, oh, I wish I didn't test so much at the beginning. It's pretty hard to test too much. And then finally, go live doesn't mean go home. Think about the value adds you can provide after the application is in place and the kinds of data you can analyze to provide value to your clients. So, happy to take more questions. I'll let you moderate that, Gavin, so let me know what questions come in and I'll be happy to take them as they come. But otherwise, thanks everyone for coming. There is a technology trends report that we did recently, and I'm actually writing a white paper at the moment on app advisory, which should be ready in the next few weeks. So if you go to this site and leave the details, we'll be happy to send that to you when it's ready. Or there's also that tech trends report that we wrote last year that we'll be happy to share with you. So thanks again. If you've got time, please stay on the line for questions and I'll be able to take as many as we've got to finish out the hour. So Gavin, over to you.
Thanks, Grant. Thank you for that excellent presentation. We have a question from Leanne, and this is quite a common question I hear. It's around privacy data security. So can you provide any advice around how we can be better armed to understand the potential privacy data security issues from use of apps?
Yeah.
Are there any particular questions you recommend we ask app vendors?
Yep, great question. Yeah, so the first obvious one is where do they host their data? And are there any constraints around the client's line of business that makes that really important? So for example, you might have clients that have to keep certain data onshore, especially, for example, if you had government clients, that's a pretty key requirement, but there's other industries that have that requirement as well. Make sure that they are compliant with those areas. And so as I mentioned, you know, just understanding whether it's Azure, AWS, or something else is just really the first question. What you go beyond that is really going to depend. First, make sure the application is managing sensitive data. If it's not, it might be overkill to really go into this area. But if you are looking at, you know, private client information about their business, more often than not, you'll find that there's these sensitive pieces in there that do need to be protected. So analyze what it is that you need to have protected and then understand how that will be protected. Ask things like, if, for example, it's integrating with another solution to pull data, how do they manage the security around that? Do they store usernames and passwords in their solution to be able to connect to these other places? If so, how do they protect those? And does that get encrypted when they're transmitting data between applications? So really looking at data, as we say, at rest. How is it stored at rest and what are the protections in place there is one part of it, but then also the data in transit is the other side. So what protections do they have in place to make sure when they are connecting with other applications and other places and sources of data that malicious parties can't read that information as it passes through?
Another question around what are some of the easier verticals to get involved in with app advisory, in your view?
Yep. Yeah, so I mentioned before the point of sale being a good one. So I definitely recommend that as a space. Before you get there, I'd even say look at things like your reporting applications and your receipt banks and data capture applications. They're really the easy place because those are systems that you're already typically familiar with. So those are areas where you may not need an integration partner or a cloud integrator. You can simply provide an end-to-end solution around those. But once again, do be careful about focusing on one particular application. Always focus on the problem rather than the solution whenever you start a new engagement. So make sure you've got enough information about the other solutions that are in place so you're not just giving everyone the same cookie cutter that might not be the right fit for them. In terms of other low-hanging fruits, it really does get more industry specific beyond that, I think. So look at what you've got in terms of clients and understand if that's a space that might be easy for you to get into. Obviously, if it's like medical practice management solutions, that's a whole doozy in itself. So that's something you would not go into. But if it's something around basic legals, around giving people legal contracts, things like that, that might be an area where you can provide some success.
Thanks, Grant. I think that's all we have time for. So I'd just like to thank you for that. That was Grant Quick, Senior Solutions Engineer with Intuit Australia. I'd also like to thank Intuit QuickBooks for bringing today's presentation. A recording will be available and we sent out to all people who registered. So please, Grant, thank you once again for such an excellent presentation.
Great. Thanks, Gavin. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate you coming.
I'll pass back to Michelle.
Thanks, Gavin. Thank you very much, Grant. And just a reminder, there will be that short survey form that should pop up as you exit, top right-hand corner. Do appreciate the feedback. It really is important if you take the 15 to 20 seconds to fill that out. If you get a warning sign, it's just telling you you're being redirected, and that is totally fine as well. Look forward to having you back on board with another CPA session soon. Thanks, everybody.